Hello, I'm Mauser Man. This is going to be part 2 in our series on long rifles, carbines, and short rifles. Part 1 was on the military use cases as well as why militaries used different versions. This video is going to be on those same things, but for the modern collector. Now, a few things first. One, in the last video, I talked, at least to some degree, about modern rifles like this one, talking about the 20-inch ARs and the shorter ones, and maybe a little bit I touched on AKs, I can't quite remember. In this one, I'm going to be talking only about the classic wood and steel firearms and bolt guns, because this is just in a different category, I think, for the modern collector. Number 2, I'm currently in the process of transferring all of my backlog as well as current videos onto Utreon. YouTube has been quite difficult to YouTube channels recently, particularly gun channels, but I think all channels have been affected by some YouTube policies. And so I'm just moving there as a backup. I will still upload to YouTube as long as I possibly can. However, another advantage of that is that if you're interested in supporting the channel, there will be a subscription service you can do there, and I just wanted to share that with you guys. Alright, now to the video. For collecting, one of the biggest details that I can't really quantify is what do you like and what can you afford? I could stand here talking all day about all of these different guns, but they might be out of your budget, or it might just not be something that you personally are interested in. For example, this Mauser Man M44, I just think it's cool and I like shooting it. And there's really no way to quantify that because some people really hate shooting these guns. I like the heavy recoil, I like the fireball that comes out the barrel when you pull the trigger. I think the side-folding bayonet is cool. A lot of people really don't like those things, and that's okay. Now, getting into it, typically carbines are pretty rare. And the reason for that is because in the long rifle era, long rifles were issued to everybody, and carbines were typically issued more specialty to specific troops. However, there are some exceptions there. Two of those exceptions are Mauser Man M44s, like I already shared, because towards the end of World War II, these were made in mass and issued basically in mass. Also, they were made and issued after World War II for quite a while, so they're pretty common and pretty easy to find. You can also find the Chinese Type 53 and some other M44 carbines from other countries. This Carcano is pretty similar because the Carcano was issued more than the long rifles. The carbines basically took the front scene, and so they were made and issued pretty frequently. And now, the Carcano long rifles, from my understanding, and I'm not an expert in Carcanos, are actually more rare than the Carcano carbines. Because carbines are more rare, that can lead to a higher cost sometimes, and it can lead to more difficulty in finding them. So if you want to collect them, it does take a little bit more effort. Now, typically, long rifles are older. We have this Mauser Man 1891, and it is from 1917. They stopped making this style of rifle in 1930, and a lot of them were converted to the shorter Mauser Man 9130. And that's a pretty common thing, is that the long rifles will be converted down to shorter rifles. That happened with the Carcanos as well. A lot of Carcano carbines are made from Carcano long rifles, so they have some different features. This can make some of these long rifles more difficult to find, and it can make them more difficult to find in good shape. Of course, like everything, there are some exceptions. If you can consider the Mauser Man 9130 a long rifle and not a short rifle, which I think you could since it served along carbines, it is very, very prevalent. It's probably one of the most prevalent military surplus rifles in the United States. Also, the Turkish M38 rifles, they were basically used like a universal rifle, but instead of being the carbine like the Italians did or the short rifles like the British or the Germans did, they were long rifles. So the Turkish rifles can be an exception to the long rifle being old rule. This one is from 1942, which I know that's still old, but it's not as old as that Mauser Man is. When we get into things like shootability, carbines have heavy recoil and a heavy concussion. Some people will talk about, the blind sniper has talked about shooting his under a tree, and when he shoots it under the tree, he feels a lot more of that concussion than when he shoots it just out in an open field. Now, I personally like that kind of thing, but it can be a disadvantage for some situations and for some people. If I'm taking out a new person to shoot, handing them this would be pretty scary because it can bruise your shoulder if you don't have good recoil management, and it's also just very, very loud, even compared to other rifles in its category. So carbines can have heavy recoil and heavy concussion. Also, a number of carbines have folding bayonets, like this one. So that leads to a few different things. One, for the modern shooter, the folding bayonet does add considerable weight that is basically unnecessary because you probably won't be bayoneting anything with this rifle anytime soon. So it adds unnecessary weight, which can be irritating, and also, at least in the case of the M44 as well as some other rifles, it can throw off your aim when the bayonet is extended or folded. All Mosin Nagants, or at least most Mosin Nagants, were sighted in with the bayonet extended and the bayonet in place. On the 9130, that does affect the point of impact, but because the bayonet's not hanging off of the side in both instances, it doesn't affect it as strongly. With the M44, in my experience, it has impacted the accuracy quite a bit. Not necessarily the size of the group, more so the location of the group. Obviously, that bayonet rule isn't universal, like this Carcano TS, but other Carcanos do have underfolding bayonets. This one is just not the most common kind. There are two big advantages of carbines, though, even for the modern day. Being shorter, if you find one that doesn't have the bayonet, it's typically lighter, and in all cases, it's a lot more handy and a lot easier to control. In fact, that's why I made this one from a Ishapore 2A1 with a broken barrel. So I cut it down and made this carbine, and now it's a really fun rifle to shoot. It's really handy and fun to handle. Also, a lot of these rifles shoot corrosive ammo, or at least corrosive ammo is the most prevalent on the market, or the cheapest. So if you're going to be shooting corrosive ammo, I've found it's a lot easier to clean corrosive ammo in a shorter carbine versus a longer rifle. And a lot of cleaning rods aren't long enough for some of those very, very long military rifles because they just aren't as common in the modern day. But I have no problem using a normal cleaning rod in a carbine like this one, or even some short rifles. That is the opposite of the problems with the long rifles, of course. Long rifles are long and heavy. So if you're going to be hunting with them or something where you are taking them long distances, or even finding cases that they fit in, you can have some issues with these long rifles because they're just longer than what most things are intended for. I know that seems pretty obvious, but I was not expecting that I was going to have issues finding cases that fit some of my long rifles. So when I take them to the range, sometimes I need to just wrap them up in a towel because I don't have cases that will fit them. Going along with the long and heavy thing, it's probably more than you need for most hunting applications. A short rifle or a carbine would probably do just fine. Obviously, that longer barrel isn't going to hurt you, but it is more than you need, and so that extra weight probably isn't something you're really interested in. But that does come with the advantage of the longer sight radius. So a longer sight radius means that there is a longer distance between the rear sight and the front sight, and generally, more people can shoot guns with a longer sight radius more accurately. So if you're somebody who wants to measure tight groups on paper, or you want to hunt and be able to hit a very specific part of an animal, that longer sight radius might be something that's really helpful for you. Assuming that all other factors are the same. Of course, a more poorly manufactured rifle with a longer sight radius will be less accurate than a very well manufactured rifle with a shorter sight radius. Typically, the longer gun will also have a lot less report. That means, one, because it's heavier, it will have less felt recoil hitting your shoulder. I mean, obviously the energy that's being transferred is the same, but since it's being transferred through a larger object, it feels a lot nicer to shoot. In a similar vein, because of that longer barrel, more of the powder will be burned by the time the bullet leaves the barrel, so you won't have that loud concussive blast, and you won't have as much of a fireball, and that can be advantageous for a lot of things. So, while the heavy and long gun and the forward balance can be inconvenient for some things, it also does come with some advantages. And that's where the universal short rifle really comes in. I think there are plenty of good reasons why militaries did switch to that. Yes, some of those don't really apply today, such as SMGs being substituted for carbines in some instances, but a good majority of them do. And I think that really comes down to compromise. So this is lighter than a long rifle, but it's still heavy enough that it has recoil management, and that it doesn't have that massive report that something like the M44 carbines are famous for. Also, even though it is shorter, it still has a good sight radius compared to carbines. You're getting a couple extra inches there compared to this rifle, and if you go to something that is a little bit longer of a short rifle, like the Ishapore 2A1s or the 9130s, you'll get even a little bit more sight radius. Again, I just said the 9130 is a short rifle. I think we could have a long conversation about that. But what I mean to say is, with short rifles, you do get a little bit longer sight radius, and that can be helpful. Also, they are a lot handier than that long rifle, but more shootable than the carbine. If you are looking for a case, you're not going to have an issue finding a case for a gun like this, and it's a lot easier to fit in a safe. The safe that I use has a spot for handguns or ammo or whatever you want to put there on a shelf. All of my short rifles can fit under that. The only guns that can't are my 9130, my 1891, and that M38 that you just saw. The rest of the guns fit just fine under that little shelf. So ultimately, which one should you go with? I can't really tell you because there are so many factors and so much of your situation that can dictate that. And also with military surplus, a portion of it comes down to what can you find. However, I would say that what is best for most situations, or maybe what's most well-rounded, is a universal short rifle. In general, that's the purpose it was made for, was to be both a replacement for long rifles and carbines. I like it because it's handy. I like it because it also has that longer sight radius, and it doesn't have quite so much report, and it just makes compromises in, I believe, all of the right places. Thankfully, I live in America, so I don't really have to worry about picking just one of these guns to settle down on. However, if I did, I would probably come down to a universal short rifle. Either this Ishapur 2A1, which I really, really like, because it has the advantages of that longer barrel than some of the carbines, but you still have a little bit more handiness than some of the other longer rifles. Or my Yugoslavian 2447 Mauser, because it's just a very handy rifle, and it does, I think, everything you'll need it to do. However, I'm curious, what do you think? Do you guys have a preference here, and is there a gun that you think you would go with if you could only have one military surplus rifle? In any case, I am 8mm Mauser Man, and I now need to put all of these guns away. But I lived on.
Which proves it's hard to get the best of a man named John.
John.